Is this the last iPad that I will ever own? I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Out of the announcements from WWDC 2025, Apple's annual developer conference, because there was a lot of really good stuff there for the iPad, right? The iPad is finally getting a window manager that is like macOS. It's finally getting the ability to do tasks in the background, so you can like encode a video while you're doing other things on the iPad. And it's finally getting big file manager improvements that again will make it work more like macOS. If you're an iPad power user, this is everything, well, not everything, but a lot of the things that you've been waiting for, right? And yet, as I was thinking about upgrading, because I'm definitely due for an upgrade, this is a very old iPad, as I'll talk about in just a moment, I have been having a hard time actually pulling the trigger on an iPad upgrade. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit, just sort of wander through that, because it has a lot to do with where the iPad is right now and also where Apple as a company is right now. So first, let's talk about what this iPad is. Excuse me if I look at my screen to get the specifications a little bit, but this is an iPad Pro from 2017, okay? It has an Apple A10 chip, A10X Fusion. It's got 4 gigabytes of RAM, and it's a 10.5-inch LCD screen, 120 hertz though, 2224 by 1668 pixels, and it weighs about 469 grams. This is a Wi-Fi version, no cellular in this. It only has 64 gigabytes of storage, believe it or not, and I've actually had no problem making that work with the way I use an iPad. This iPad I bought back in 2020, actually, as a refurbished model. Now, despite how old this iPad is, I actually bought this with the intention of using it like a computer, and I did do that for a while. I have this case here, which is now in quite bad shape, actually. It's a Logitech case with the keyboard and a kickstand that you can snap together around the iPad, and it basically turns into a computer. You even have the touchpad there. And I say it's in bad shape because in case you're wondering about long-term durability on some of these items, you can see it's quite worn. The plastics around the edges have come apart. I don't think that's really like a normal use thing though. I think it's just the fact it's made out of plastics that are sort of seamed here. So that's a bit disappointing, Logitech. I feel like an item like that shouldn't have that issue. It was like $200 when I bought it. Maybe it was like 160, something like that. But anyway, I did intend to use this as a computer replacement because even back then, the idea of using the iPad as a replacement for a computer was still quite popular. It was actually just becoming possible really thanks to the addition of keyboard support and official mouse support and stuff like that to iPadOS. Now, as a computer replacement, it was a failure, really. It did get better over time as some new iPad updates came out, and the mouse support in particular was improved, but in general, it just has never really felt like a computer experience, in large part, I think, due to things like the file manager and the window management system. I have fairly lax needs for an iPad as a computer, which is why I've kept this iPad for so long, because I am primarily a writer, and as you can see from this YouTube video, while I do things on YouTube, I'm not at this point some kind of elite YouTube video editor cutting all kinds of things together. I have very basic needs in those sort of performance regards. So this iPad, even with 64 gigabytes too of memory or long-term storage, is fine for my needs. And to this day, it has been very successful as an iPad. It tends to feel very performant. The only real issue I run into is the 4 gigabytes of RAM, because from time to time when I am browsing the web or going between applications that have larger file sizes, I will notice that when I switch between them, the things I've been doing in one app will disappear. And I'm pretty sure that is because of the memory management. There's not enough RAM to handle everything that's going on. So the iPad just boots whatever was in the not active application out. And that can be a little bit annoying because if you are, for example, filling out a web form while you're doing stuff like that, multitasking on the iPad, you back out of it and then you go back and all your stuff is gone. But other than that, this thing to this day is still very solid, and I use it pretty much every day for light use things, just like note taking, watching YouTube videos, and stuff like that. However, clearly, if I'm going to use an iPad as a computer, this is not going to do the job. And also, this is now going out of support. It will not be, actually, it wasn't supported by the last version of iPadOS, which was fine because the updates were kind of minor, but it's also not supported by iPadOS 26, where the updates are much larger. And that was a big reason for why I was thinking about upgrading, because I want all the great upgrades of iPadOS 26. That's just not going to be available on this iPad. So, toss it in the trash, right? Get a new iPad. Well, that's a good idea in theory, but then I started looking at specifications and the prices, and I started to get a little bit, just hesitant. I'm just not sure I can do it. And look, a lot of this comes down to the price and also the features that you get for the price. So let's start with the price in particular. This is an iPad Pro, and I would really like to buy another iPad Pro to replace it. I would probably like to get the 11-inch model because while I do want to do some computer use, I'm also very interested in using it as a tablet. So I don't want to get the largest size. Still, if I even get the 11-inch version of the iPad Pro, with the M4 chip and 256 gigabytes of memory, I believe that's the minimum now. Leave a comment if I'm wrong. In any case, that's like $900 on sale. You can typically find it, at a MSRP, or not an MSRP, but a sale price around $900. That's quite expensive, especially considering that the iPad Pro 11-inch that you get at that price point has the minimum amount of storage, and it has only 8 gigabytes of memory, while as the higher tier ones have twice as much memory, which is 16 gigabytes of memory. And if I learned one thing about buying this older iPad, it is that when it comes to iPads, I bought this refurbished thinking, this would be a better deal, and it was a good deal. It was like $470. So, I didn't pay a ton for it. But because it was already older and less capable, it went out of support pretty quick. I had it for 4 years before it went out of support from Apple, which was quite a bummer. And I'm a little bit concerned about that with any lower tier iPad or iPad Pro today. I guess I can imagine that even that 8 gigabytes of RAM might be okay for quite some time, but I don't know. With Apple Intelligence pushing the RAM amounts up, and with 16 gigabytes now being the minimum on macOS, and with macOS and iPadOS and all the other versions of Apple's OS now being much more closely linked than they were before, because they are getting rid of the last vestiges of Intel Macs, and can now sort of unify everything around Apple Silicon, I'm a little skeptical about those 8 gigabytes models, and I kind of feel like those might go out of support very quickly. Point being, the basic iPad Pro doesn't feel like a safe bet. And so what is a safe bet? Maybe the version with 1 terabyte of storage, because that's what you need to buy to get the 16 gigabytes of RAM. But that is like $1,500 on sale, which is a way higher price, and getting into real computer territory. I mean, you can buy a MacBook Pro for around that price, and that is way too much for me to pay. Okay, so then I'm like, well, maybe I'll get the iPad Air or something, right? A less expensive iPad. I mean, for what I'm doing, I just told you, this is 64 gigabytes of storage, right? It's an old iPad. Even a basic iPad today is going to be as good as this, right? I mean, 8 years have passed since this particular model actually hit store shelves? Because, again, I bought it refurbished, and it was kind of old at the time that I got it refurbished. So surely, things have progressed. And in some ways, like the performance and the memory and the storage, of course they have. But in other ways, they haven't. If you get, and in fact, I bought a base iPad last year thinking I might replace this iPad Pro with it. And what I realized, and what you might be surprised to hear, is that in several ways, that new base iPad is still dramatically worse than this old iPad Pro. In particular, the base iPad still feels much thicker and heavier, although the numbers aren't much different on paper. Once you actually get things in your hands, you start to realize that very small differences in thickness and in weight actually make a huge difference when you're holding something for, minutes at a time. The screen is also much worse on the new base level iPads. I really don't like that you don't get 120 hertz refresh rate until an iPad Pro. I think that is absolutely positively ludicrous. I like a higher refresh rate is one of the most amazing things for the feeling of responsiveness on a device you're touching. And the fact that Apple insists on making that a pro feature is absolutely bonkers at this point. It's the new like 8 GB MacBook thing for Apple. Like it's something that they just insist on doing that seems absolutely made to actually make you spend more money. But even beyond that, the base iPads, the way the screens are laminated, they still have a very large gap between the surface of the screen and the actual LCD beneath them. And comparing that to, this very old iPad Pro was super noticeable and distracting. I hated it. So I returned that base level iPad. And, I'm thinking about maybe an Air, like an M2 Air. Like that seems like a very solid tablet, but I've gone and checked them out. I've used them before, and they still have the 60 hertz refresh rate, and I really don't like that. So I am sort of feeling pushed and pressured by Apple to buy a more and more and more expensive tablet because they refuse to bring features that I think should be quite commonplace down to lower price points. And I think that situation really stinks. Apple has become an expert at manipulating their product ladder so that every rung seems to just be lacking something that for the price you would kind of expect the device might have. And so you end up just getting pushed a little higher, a little higher, a little higher. Oh, this inexpensive one doesn't have all the ports. Oh, there's no 120 hertz screen. Oh, it's got like less RAM. Or the minimum storage is very low, which is now the case with the Macs. The minimum storage feels ridiculously low. So you just end up getting pushed higher. Eventually, you upgrade that base model to a point where it's as expensive as the base model of the more expensive rung. So like if you start with an iPad, you add an upgrade, you end up in the iPad Air price range. You add a storage upgrade to that, you're going to start to end up in iPad Pro price range, and you just go up and up and up. And next thing you know, you're spending $1,500 on an iPad, which is just absurd. Really, the Mac Mini is the only one that kind of avoids this, although with 256 gigabytes of storage, it is actually quite crammed still. Fortunately, you can get around that with an external storage solution. Now, another thing also that's really been bothering me about getting an iPad, and I think is a major issue for Apple right now, is the you'll own nothing and you'll like it vibe, which you probably have heard a lot about on YouTube. There's a lot of people making videos about this. And the iPad really is emblematic, I think, of that idea. Now, obviously, you own the iPad, right, if you buy it. But you can't really do anything to it or with it in terms of upgrades or customization. You buy it, and then if, like mine, it goes out of support in the future, then you are just, up a creek without a paddle. And, of course, the same is also true of MacBooks these days, and MacBooks are also headed this way, unfortunately. But it's not just the hardware or most of the hardware. It's actually the software, because I really don't like the fact that with the iPad and it being on the App Store, anything that I buy in there in terms of an app or a subscription, I'm not going to really own that because it only works within Apple's ecosystem. And eventually, older apps do sometimes fail to get support for the newer operating systems, and they just sort of sail silently into the night, and then you spent money on something you can't actually use anymore. In addition to that, there's also just a lot of subscriptions on the iPad. If you are an iOS user in general or sign up for Mac, even Mac stuff too, you'll notice that things on the Mac App Store are very heavily dominated. The premium apps are very heavily dominated by subscriptions. Most of these apps want you to sign up for a subscription. So you've got a subscription for a calorie counter. You've got a subscription for a budgeting app. You've got a subscription for all kinds of other things. And wow, does that add up quickly, right? All of a sudden you're spending $100 or more a month on subscriptions for things that you really could just buy once and use forever in the past at least, and still can, especially on the PC, for example. So that has really given me a lot of hesitation, because even if I get this, I spend all this money on this iPad Pro, and it's amazing and wonderful, then I'm stuck in this ecosystem where I have to spend even more money every month just to keep using the software and services that I've already paid money to use. I think this is something that Apple really should change its tune on, because at this point, I think for a lot of people, the appeal of the walled garden approach is starting to go away. And there's also a lot of legal hurdles that are starting to come up as more scrutiny is placed on the idea that you buy a iPad or another Apple product or any product for that matter, and you get locked to a single source of apps that also has totally free ability to revoke those apps at any time that either the developer feels like it, or the developer is unable to any longer support that app and it gets broken by a new update, or because Apple feels like it, or whoever owns that platform feels like it. And or maybe like with the new Nintendo Switch 2 is a big criticism I've had of it, is that they can just boot you off. They feel like they've detected you maybe sideloading some apps, or they think you're doing some bootleg and they're just gonna completely brick your Switch 2. It's absurd. It's totally absurd. I refuse to buy a Switch 2 for that reason, and I think like if I refuse to buy a Switch 2 for that reason, how distant is the iPad from that? Do I really want to invest in this ecosystem that is becoming more and more capable, and for which I would want to buy better and better and better apps, which are presumably going to be more expensive, and yet not really have much ownership or control over any of that? So that's my thoughts in general, but I'm not quite done yet because I haven't quite answered my question. Is this my last iPad? And I made it a question because I'm still not quite sure, right? Like, the less expensive iPads are quite inexpensive. And maybe I just end up buying one of those and sucking up the issues with them because I still want something to browse the web and to watch some YouTube videos. And I guess paying, $350 for a base iPad that can do that job is not the end of the world. So maybe I'll end up going that route. But I have taken some other measures to sort of fill in gaps of things that I were using my iPad for. So here's a good one. Here's my new iPad. A paper journal. Wow. I mean, look, note taking is something that I do. I don't really go in for the second brain, like, spend most of my time trying to think about being productive kind of way of going about things. But I do take notes very frequently. I keep a calendar and my events on it and whatnot. And I did buy a new journal to keep things together, and it's been going very well. That is actually another failure of the iPad, by the way. In terms of handwriting notes, it never has really quite worked for me. Now, that maybe those new iPads with the better, the Apple Pencil Pro and whatnot would resolve that issue. But for me, despite the fact that digital note-taking has really become amazingly better than it was 15 years ago when I first started seeing it being used, it's still not quite there for me. It just doesn't quite feel immediate enough. So, paper notebook. Another thing is maybe I'm just going to stick with my phone more often, because although this is obviously a much smaller screen than the iPad, it's still fine for a lot of web browsing. If I need to, I've been playing Grim Dawn, a RPG lately, action RPG, a fairly niche one, and every now and then I'll need to look up some tips because I can't find something, and I use my iPad for that very frequently. But I can also use my phone, and it's fine. It's actually great, for that sort of situation. There's really no issue with it whatsoever. So maybe I just use my phone for that sort of thing. Also, I don't like the app ecosystem on the iPhone because it's the same as with the iPad, but I don't generally buy many iPhone apps because I'm not an iPhone power user in that regard. The main reason actually I have the iPhone Pro is because of the cameras. I take a fair number of photos for the product reviews that I do, and I need decent cameras, and I find the iPhone is actually at this point a lot better to use than a DSLR. It's a lot quicker to set up and takes perfectly great photos. And so, I'm finding myself really thinking that the iPad is not going to have a great fit in my life at this point. And this also makes me wonder about the entire idea of the iPad Pro and this decade-long arc we've taken where the iPad has become more and more like a computer. I was very excited about it for quite some time. I mean, I bought the iPad that I did in 2020 thinking I would use it as a computer. But now that I reflect on that, I'm starting to feel like maybe this was kind of a doomed endeavor from the start, primarily because of Apple's attitudes towards its hardware ladder and how it really just wants to set the options out in a way that is seemingly designed to make people buy the most expensive item that their wallets can possibly tolerate. And then also Apple's really restrictive app ecosystem, which might get cracked up a bit with some of the legal proceedings as of late, but is still a major issue. Can you have an iPad Pro that supposedly works like a computer while at the same time not having the ability to just buy and outright own apps and load them in any way that you would like? Is that really possible? Let's not even to mention things like programming and coding, which the iPad still is incredibly restrictive about due to just the way iOS is locked down as an operating system. You're not firing up a terminal on the iPad to do whatever the heck it is you want to do to customize your system or do some programming and so on and so forth. And that doesn't seem like it's going to change anytime soon. So what about that aspect of the iPad Pro? I mean, I do actually do a little bit of programming here and there for my own personal hobbyist use, but it's still something I want to do. And so that makes me think I do need to just stick to computers instead of iPads. And I don't see any resolution for this in the near future. Now, I'm going to keep an eye on things. I might spring for an iPad if I feel like some of these questions are getting resolved or I see a really good sale. I keep an eye on the refurbished store because maybe I haven't learned my lesson. If I see an iPad Pro 11-inch go up for, I don't know, like $700 or something, maybe I could tolerate that. But for right now, I am feeling like that maybe this iPad, my belongs in a museum iPad Pro with the chunky bezels, maybe I just keep this thing until it dies. I don't know. What are you thinking about the iPad right now and Apple's sort of approach to iPad Pro in general? I'd like to hear your thoughts. This has been a bit of a rant, but I felt like ranting on this one. And I'm still sort of going back and forth on it. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. See you next time.